Hello, my name is Sif, and this is the Heathen Hangout Podcast. I think it's episode 3, it might be episode 4, we'll figure it out. This time around, I am joined by some excellent people to talk about literature. As broad as that topic is, we'll go for the early medieval period / Nordic literature and see where we end up with. So who wants to go first on the introductions?
I'll go first.
There we go.
Hi, my name is Rich. I'm the former chair of Astro UK. I'm podcaster, almost author, and various other things like that. You can find me all over the internet, usually under the name of Wolf and Man Book or something like that.
Thank you, Rich. Who's up next?
I'll go next. I'm Dan. I've been on the podcast before, so regular listeners might recognise my voice. Also, a UK background, so I'm the General Secretary. I run Heathens of Yorkshire and various other pagan-y things. My sort of area of interest in literature, I'm currently doing a PhD in medieval literature, so it's somewhat important to me.
Oh, amazing. And Nick, you're up next.
Hi guys, I'm Nick. First podcast I've done actually, so this is monumental. Looking forward to it. Not much background or titles to share with you. Currently a teacher of English and classics, so there may be some Greek literature crossover. Can't promise that that's not going to happen. Sorry, not sorry. And just really just general word / literature nerd. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining me on this rather miserable, what was a miserable January day. At least here in the Midlands. So the rough sort of sketch that I have for this episode is to start with the Poetic and Prose Edda in terms of whether you've read them, whether you consider them important in your practice, how much it influences your practice, and basically we'll spin off from there. Well, for me, I've read them, and I'm pretty critical about them in general. Anyone have any thoughts to start this conversation off?
Well, we can't start without, we have to talk about the Havamal, the one that most heathens have, at least, if they haven't read it, they probably have a copy. Mm-hmm. Or they've quoted from it.
Yeah.
And I won't say it's problematic. Well, there is some problematic stuff in it, but there's also some very good stuff in it. There's a continuous debate among heathens about, is it a collection of the sayings of Odin, or is it just proverbs and things that people in Iceland liked? Maybe it's both, you know?
Yeah, I think that kind of hits on probably the key point that maybe people sort of listening will be thinking about as well, is that, you know, we've got these sources and the Poetic and Prose Edda are kind of held up as the sort of most important bits of literature for heathens, but we generally as heathens don't think that they are the words of the gods passed down to us. We are generally of an understanding that, you know, they are stories that are based on an oral tradition that have then been written down around about the 13th century, in one case by a known Christian scholar, in the other case by, we're not so sure. So that kind of leads into the whole debate as to, you know, how far can you consider them sacred texts when you know that they've been through those filters, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for myself, I've not finished reading either of them. I have them, and I am working my way through them, but they are quite difficult texts to really engage with. For a cursory read, you need to have some primer to what you're going to be getting yourself in for, and if you haven't got a mind for literature, then it will be a struggle. I love various forms of literature, but I'm still having to sort of reread a chapter before I progress, just to make sure I actually understand what's going on before I can even access the deeper meaning or understanding behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, you know, when you're reading a text that you think, oh, this is going to tell me all about heathenry, and it opens with Jesus, and you're like, hang on, what's this guy doing here? And unless you've got that understanding that that's kind of like, that was a preface that Snorri tacked on there so that he could get away with writing down what he was writing about. But I remember like way back when I was first getting into heathenry, I found that really, really odd when the opening of the book is like, oh, but don't worry, guys, it's all Christian, really. And you're like, that's not really what I'm looking for. So yeah, you do. You're right, Nick. You've got to have that primer. You've got to have that understanding of, right, what am I looking at here? And how can I then sort of try and get through that filter to get to some useful sort of heathen content and something to base a value system on, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's partially why at least partially why there are so many problematic elements, because accessing these texts does require a degree of criticality. Before you're able to access them, you need to be able to interrogate a text and at a basic level and just go, well, right, why was something written that way? So when you say, Dan, about, opening up with all about Jesus, it is difficult for people to reconcile with, well, why is someone writing the stories, the tales of mythological heroes, mythological gods, goddesses, when they are ostensibly a Christian practitioner?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, another thing that complicates matters when you're looking for sort of deep spiritual meaning is that we're looking at texts that were written originally in a very, very complicated poetic form, which have then been translated to English. And there are a lot of incidences where, it's been written in a certain way to fit the poetic form. And when that then gets translated into English, it looks very strange, and you can't quite work out, well, why are they saying that? What that doesn't necessarily fit with my expectation. So, even when you're reading it in the original language, it's hard enough. But when you're adding in that it's then been, gone through various layers of translation as well, it's another complicated thing. But I think we shouldn't be too down and look how hard it all is, because obviously it is possible to get past these challenges, because a lot of people do find a lot of spiritual meaning and do, find enough stuff to base a practice on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. In fact, I think it speaks to those that are practitioners of heathenry in particular, because the Norse literature tends to sort of portray these flawed, doomed heroes that really do struggle. They almost embody resilience. Where if you look at literature from outside, they are looking at other flaws, perhaps. So, and I'm just going to say this because this is a basis for my understanding. When it comes to the Greek heroes, for example, like Achilles or Odysseus, they're defined by their prowess, their intelligence, but they're often undone by their pride rather than their lack of resilience.
Oh, please continue if you want to on any classical stuff.
I'll get in there. Don't worry.
Well, I can bridge the gap here, because I think it's the Havamal, going back again, it's one of my favourite topics, is actually, there's a theory that says it's not Icelandic in origin or Norse in origin at all. It is essentially a crude sort of cover version of the sayings of Cato, or I forget what it's called. It's called the Dictats of Cato, or something like that. Yeah. And it was used as it was super well known throughout the world, because people learning Latin would have to translate that. It was like nice little small phrases. I don't believe that, but that's a theory. But I do dispute it. But I was also thinking about what you were saying earlier about the translation, because it's like, well, which translation do you read? Because often the translations people have access to are out of copyright ones. So some of those are okay, some are not. And how do you judge a translation? Because you're translating, or the translator is translating not just the words, but also the meaning and the sense behind them. Mm-hmm. You're translating things like idiom, which gets incredibly difficult to sort of... and so some are more poetic, trying to keep the poetic vibe. Some are super accurate to the language, but are dull as ditch water to read. So it really does vary.
Does anyone have any favorite translations? Sorry, Dan, I'm gonna stop interrupting you. Please go forward.
I wasn't going to say my favorite translation. I was just going to elaborate on Rich's point a bit, and maybe say that actually, if you aren't able to look at it in the original language, then I think the best thing to do is to try and look at as many different translations as you can and try and get a sense from that. Because, as Rich said, it's impossible to translate any text, certainly any poetic text, and keep the meter, keep the form, keep the metaphors, and keep the meaning. You just can't do it. You can pick one and then stick to that, and then do the others as best you can, and that's the best thing you can do. So I think just trying to look at translations that take those different approaches, and then try and sort of get the sense of the original text from that, because it's much more sort of pleasant reading when you keep one that keeps the poetic form, because as humans we generally like poetry. But you might lose a load of the meaning in that. So, and the other thing, a quick point I wanted to make was on the fact that the easily accessible texts in terms of get your hands on them are the out of copyright ones, which are generally translated into very archaic English, which then don't make them all that accessible to a modern reader. So whilst having to pay for more modern translations might be annoying when you're like, oh, I could just get the free one, you're probably going to get more out of the more modern translation because it's going to translate it into language that's more relatable.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the criticality comes into it, because you can work backwards, starting at the most basic, understandable version, and then using that as a stepping stone onto perhaps the more archaic forms that you've mentioned, I think is a really, really good way to approach it. And just to pick up on as well what Rich was saying about idioms, I mean, they're so... the cultural knowledge that you need to have to understand a single idiom is mind-boggling. We have lost so much over the years in terms of cultural identity, where it's shifted, evolved, grown together, grown apart, where cultures have just completely vanished with very, very little written records. Hint, hint, Old Norse. Apart from what's been translated through, say, Snorri Sturluson, for example, or other authors that came later. So if you're not at least prepared to show the same resilience that those that are spoken of when it comes to the homework for heathenry, which I think, as we all agree, is heathenry is the faith of homework. You need to read a lot. If you're not able to embody that level of resiliency, then it is going to become much more difficult, I think.
Yeah, and I think we should probably say that not everybody has to be a scholar. You can be a heathen without being a scholar, but as you say, Nick, there is definitely a level whereby you are going to have to do some pretty deep thinking, and it's not just going to be spoon-fed to you. I think, it's a challenging religion to get, or belief system to get into, because of all these complex issues. It's very, very rewarding. It's brilliant, and I love it. But yeah, you're right. It is the religion with homework. And yeah, I think we do sort of. I think maybe we sort of kind of take for granted how much thinking and challenging ourselves and challenging our ideas that we do. And I know certainly having seen some discussions on some forums recently from some non-heathens that seem to think that actually all we do is sort of dress up and shout skull. It's maybe let's
face it, we do that.
I mean, we do that too, but we also do an awful lot of reading.
You're not the real Odin. You can't tell me what to do, Dan.
Oh, yes.
I also just really quickly wanted to go back to Sif's question that I interrupted by going back to a previous point, just to sort of bring this full circle in a weird kind of thing. If you are looking for a good modern translation, I think Carolyne Larrington's translation of the Poetic Edda is a really good one to start on, and that's available as an Oxford World Classics. It's not expensive. The RRP is £9.99. Not that I'm just like trying to sell her book, because I'm not receiving any money for this, but like that is a good.
Come on, Dan. What's the commission? Come on, be honest.
Oh, I wish I was getting a commission on
Carolyne
Larrington's book.
I'd also like to add, in terms of audio book versions, there's the one, I think it's on Apple Audio. I think a few other places. Patricia Terry, which has has different voices or different voice actors for each. Part of the it's quite good.
And if you're looking for a good version of the Havamal, then the Yorkshire Havamal, sayings at Tallfather, is great as long as you can speak Tyke.
I can recommend it.
Well, there is obviously there's the AUK sort of version of the Havamal, which again has 4 out of copyright translations plus the Old Norse. You can compare and contrast there if you want. But I was just looking up something as a document I made a long time ago with 9 different translations. And I was just looking at, this is the example of like some of the verses that are so different. This goes back to the first verse I ever heard from the Havamal was on a heavy metal record, which is all sort of like, well-being I won and wisdom too. Great, except in all the other translations, it says, then I began to grow and gain an insight. Well, that's not well-being I won. What the hell? It's just obviously somebody just playing with words, but here's the weird thing. I don't know who did that translation. Still trying to track it down. One day I'll figure it out.
Interesting. I would say my favourite would also be Carolyne Larrington. That's the one I referenced the most when I do my work, just general research. Obviously, Crawford's is another popular one. I think that would, in the scale of like between keeping the poetic essence and being accessible, I would put Crawford as accessible in terms of getting the rough idea of what each verse and each line is about. Carolyne Larrington I see somewhere in the middle, a nice marriage between both of those areas. So and then you have people like Hollander who are even more towards the poetic side, and then you got Bray and Bellows, who are those archaic sort of versions. But yeah, I mean, there are so many different translations. I know a lot of them are available online for free on like sacred texts. So if if you don't have access to those like paid versions, there's loads and loads and loads of versions online that you can look up. They just tend to be older.
And also to add in one more thing, in terms of even the actual Old Norse isn't right. Because the way it was written in the surviving documents is nothing like what you'll see if you find what they call the corrected Old Norse. It's got like weird like spelling mistakes, grammatical errors, all kinds of things. It looks nothing like, or there's K's written instead of C's and that kind of stuff. So it's
I mean, if you're going, that deep, and why not? Let's fall down that hole.
Oh yeah.
Even so, but yeah, you'll have set me off now, Rich. So again, like we need to dispel any idea that there is one Old Norse text of, say, the prose Edda that was handwritten by Snorri himself, and that you can just go and read. It does not exist. Sorry.
It was not written in runes either.
It was definitely not written in runes. It was written in Latin script. But even then, the original doesn't survive. And what does survive is several different versions, which are similar but different. So you get what's called an edition, which is where someone has basically mashed those together and gone, I think that this is the best thing. But of course, that is still subjective, So
yeah.
There's always going to be areas for debate and areas for discussion and differences, because even the Old Norse is not agreed upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Snorri, what we have was unfinished, I believe, to be at the time of his death, and he died in like his basement cellar kind of thing, murdered grimly. And what was left was, I think, his nephew, was it Sturla? I think, basically collected what was there, and then manuscript copies were made of those. And obviously you've got to keep in mind that everyone was handwriting these, so that's when some of the spelling errors leak in, and the scribes could change things as well. So what we're seeing is, even from that earliest time period of like shortly after Snorri's death, we have potential changes being made. And, there was a massive fire in Copenhagen in the 18th century, which basically burned a lot of the sagas that we obviously had been lost now. So you got to consider not only just the Christian biases, but then like just layers and layers and layers and layers of additional changes being made. So keep that in mind when you're reading the literature.
Yeah, I think there might be a good segue there because you mentioned sagas. Should we maybe move away from the Eddas for a little bit, as exciting as they are, and talk about sagas? Because, like, I know sagas have a big influence on you, Rich, and your practice. And I know a lot of heathens look to the sagas for sort of evidence of ritual practices and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think to link to other sort of heathen literature like Beowulf, which again is a tricky one to translate as well because of idiom and all the similar sort of things. There are some heathens who derive an awful lot of information from the way that people conduct themselves because it's like highly ritualized behavior and that kind of stuff. I don't entirely agree with it, but at least it is a surviving document. And what's really interesting, there were 2 transcribers. And the first transcriber is trying to update the language because it was archaic even then. Then it stops. Then this other guy is given the job and just, I can't be bothered. It's like updating it. I'll just write it as is. So their language shifts to like more archaic forms about halfway through.
Yeah. I mean, Beowulf's a good one because it has one of very, very few surviving actual rituals preserved in the text. I think that's the only instance of Sumbul from the period, from roughly the period that we have, is the Sumbul that takes place in Hrothgar's hall. And I think that's another thing, isn't it? Everyone's like, we'll go to the sagas, there'll be loads of rituals and it'll tell us exactly how to do our rituals. But the problem is, of course, at the time of writing, or certainly at the time when it was, being told orally, everyone knew what a ritual was. So the storyteller just says, and then they did a ritual, and that's it. It's so rare that they actually give us anything. We get a little bit of talking about seers and sort of prophetic rituals like that. We've got the Sumbul in Beowulf, and then we've got the Volsci ritual, and those are the only ones.
I love
the Volsci ritual, for anyone that doesn't know, is there's some argument that it was a parody, and this kind of ritual never happened anyway. But as I say, given it's the only one that we've got sort of fully written out and described, but it involves passing a horse penis around a table.
Yeah, hail to the giantess. Yeah.
Hail to the giantess.
Well, there's another ritual I'm thinking of. It's in the Eric the Red saga where they have the woman, they get the specialist in who sits on this high seat and has the women chanting around her.
Yeah. So that's where we get the high seat ritual. And again, I always find it really funny that there are certain people who are like, no, Seder's rubbish, it doesn't exist. When actually we've only really got 3 rituals recorded, and one of them is Seder.
Yeah.
And even when it wasn't Seder, there's I think it's Grettius saga where there's this guy who has the antagonist of the story who actually outlives the hero, because sagas are odd like that. But I'm sure he has like a witch woman. It was described or was translated as some evil sorceress, depending upon the translation. But unfortunately, you get the crappy, tacked-on Christian ending. And then the evil man, the evil woman, became a monk and a nun and were religious and Christian for the rest of their lives. Hang on.
Of course they were.
Saga of bloodshed and absolutely berserk. And then it's like, you know what? I'm tired of that. It's time to move on. All right.
Oh, dear. Oh, I love sagas. Yeah, I mean, at the moment I'm doing a massive deep dive into troll women, so that ties in perfectly, and the idea of like the troll as the other and the way that sort of manifested. So I've been reading a lot of the sagas anyway, and yeah, just some of the ways. My favorite thing about sagas is when they just end with "and then they died," and you think.
Having started with the entire family tree going back 400 years, and then the ending is just, and then they died.
Okay. But early on, I got this huge tome called the Saga Horde or something like that. I don't know who printed it, but what struck me is that how bloody dull some of those sagas are. It's just like some long discussion about property rights. And are there no dragons or monsters here?
Well, it's like there's a couple of good bits in amongst a lot of dullness. Like Njal's saga's got some incredible bits, but for the most part, it's just court proceedings.
Yeah. Well, as we know, there's even a ghost story or like a zombie, like a Draugr story, which is a legal discussion. It devolves instead of just being, oh my god, undead sailors. No, we must discuss this legally. What?
Yeah, but it works.
Yeah, it works.
They basically challenge the ghost sailors legally, and then they're basically like, yeah, okay, fair cop, we'll go.
Outside of that, the Norse sagas themselves, overall, they just tend to be quite terse in style anyway. So as you mentioned, you have these sometimes really incredibly long lists of names, for example, but the actual description, the lushness of detail is really lacking, and it really does make it difficult to heathen at times, because you're like, well, what do we do here? Sort of just making it up and hope it's correct, or
I think it's I suppose the rules of storytelling, which we have a familiar concept at beginning, middle, and end. There's an arc, whereas those rules didn't exist then. So, okay, how will we start? We'll tell you about the hero's dad for a bit. Okay. Oh, his dad also had a brother. No, right. When does the story start? And eventually you get the hero, 3 chapters in. So why do we hear about his dad? His dad never comes back into it. Well, what was the point of that?
Context.
I mean, I think context, but also I think something that we can take and we can see it was clearly very important to them to remember people. I think, that's a heathen value that we can pick up on in that, is that clearly reputation and being remembered after you were dead was important. So maybe, actually these long lists mean nothing to us, but for the people at the time, they probably, that was them keeping the memory of those people alive, even if it is just to say son of somebody, son of somebody, son of somebody. That's keeping that person alive, because, we're still reading those names 1,000 years later. Yeah, that's the only thing we know about them, but we still know their name.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at sort of like Egil's saga again, where they talk about the what's the words, the needing song, something.
Oh, the knitting pole.
That's the one. The knitting pole, where you're cursing someone. You're essentially cursing them with shame. And not to be remembered, which is when we have the name of the person they're trying to curse. but it absolutely speaks to that value of ancestor worship in particular, and this idea of carrying forward the memories and the name in that continuous cycle of my Norse terms are out at the moment. Is it the Hummingja, the ancestral luck? Where you're so you're carrying forward your ancestral luck. You're remembering your ancestors. They may not have done great things, but it doesn't mean that they can't be remembered to then go, right, this is what we should not be doing, for example. This is a moral guide for us to say, let's not act in this way, so that we can pass on more Hummingja for the future generations that is more positive. It is more positive.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it, isn't it? Like, I was just going to say, so maybe you might go to the sagas thinking, oh, I'm going to get loads of good stuff for ritual. That might not be there. I mean, it's not, apart from maybe 4 cases. But what is there, again, if you're willing to do the homework and do the reading and do the drudgery, is lots of evidence of value systems.
Yes.
What is behavior to be praised, what is behavior to be shunned, what was held to be important. Arguably I think you're going to get more of that from the sagas than you necessarily will from the Eddas, other than Havamal, which is very much like, this is a guide for life. And I should point out, a guide, it's not like you will burn for all eternity if you don't do this. It's like, if you do this, your mates will think you're a bit of a dick. And it's like, oh yeah, my mates probably would think I'm a bit of a dick if I did that.
That does seem to be that underpins pretty much everything in the Havamal. I'm sure there's small print there underneath that just says, if you don't do this, you're a bit of a dick.
Yeah. It's like there's no eternal punishment. It's not a sin. It's just like your peers will judge you for this, and they won't be impressed. Whereas if you act like this,
it also has good advice. It says like, no one will judge you if you say, "I've had enough to drink. I'm going to go to bed now," which is a very, very good thing, because people think, "Oh, it's all about getting drunk," and actually, no, it actually says that. No one will think anything bad of you.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of people think that heathenry is just about getting absolutely blottoed on mead, but as you say, the Havamal, which if you do take that as a guide to what you should do, then you shouldn't get blottoed on mead. You should have a little bit, and you should know your limits.
And that's I think that's an absolutely beautiful point, because these days there is so much placed on not being able to keep up, for example, in terms of drinking. So myself, I'm teetotal. I go to these gatherings and I drink water. I don't even I'm an annoying vegan because I can't have the non-alcoholic mead that people are starting to produce. But the focus there is entirely on enforcing someone's actions through shame. And when we tie that in with this focus on action and deeds that pervades throughout all of the saga, so look at Njal's saga, for example. You're looking at actions in the future rather than what they're thinking internally. And with this focus on actions and deeds and making sure that you're not being shamed by the community, I think it's very interesting that one of the ways they try to limit the impact of shame being abused as a social control measure was by saying, actually, if someone doesn't feel like staying up late tonight, they can go to bed, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
The hot take.
Yeah, but I think sort of certainly within our AUK community now, I think that people are actually, taking those bits of the Havamal more seriously, and I think there is certainly less of a, you have to keep up, you have to be matching everyone pint for pint kind of mentality now than there was even, sort of 5 or 6 years ago, and a lot of people are going teetotal, and that's absolutely fine. Like, I think there is the thing whereby, there's this idea that offerings have to be alcohol because Odin only drinks alcohol, and that's fine. If you're offering specifically to Odin, then it makes sense to offer, something Odin's going to be able to drink. But you don't just offer to Odin, do you? There's plenty of other deities and ancestors and spirits that you're offering to. So, this idea that it has to be alcohol and the sacred mead and all of this, it's not really. We've got the idea of the mead of poetry. But again, that's the mead of poetry. It makes good poetry, or the mead of bad poetry makes bad poetry. But it's not, it's not necessarily sacred. It's just poetry.
Yeah. I mean, offerings themselves are incredibly personal anyway. It's something that, we can attach some UPG to that in terms of, have I sat under a tree and sort of thought, oh, give me something, gods, what would you like to receive from me? Or just trying out various different offerings. So whilst I am teetotal, that's not going to stop me from offering mead to Odin, because it's the meaning behind the offering itself. I may not drink it, but I'm still sacrificing it in a way, because I'm making sure that Odin is having something that perhaps I've spent money on or time to make, for example.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're probably going too far down a rabbit hole on what's appropriate sacrifices, which will probably be another episode. but you're right.
Feel
like,
free.
there is so much there as to, what a sacrifice should be and what it shouldn't be. And, there are some things in the literature. Obviously, quite a lot of places in the literature, it will be live animal sacrifice. Which of course, today we don't necessarily do. We're not doing that at our events or anything like that. But that's because what makes an appropriate sacrifice changes with time, doesn't it? And what's meaningful to you and meaningful to the god and appropriate within your society. Sacrificing an animal when you live in a harsh European winter, and you need your animals to stay alive, Sacrificing one of them is a big sacrifice because it's a big deal to you. If I just go and buy a live chicken that I've not raised myself, doesn't mean anything to me, lob its head off, is that a sacrifice? Probably not, because it doesn't have the same value. You know, the same value now might be, I don't know, sacrificing your month's rent payment or something. You know, that would be a huge sacrifice. Then you've got nowhere to live. But that would be the same thing. You've sacrificed your animal, now you've got nothing to eat. So,
that's something that I think is misunderstood, sometimes purposefully. And I mean, let's face it. Let's deal with the fact that when it comes to human sacrifice, because that's often something that is looked at. People hear the word heathens and they'll go, "Oh, blood sacrifice," and they've got all of these preconceptions and indeed misconceptions about what has happened. Mainly because the sources that we have of it are biased. We have some, not a lot, some which might speak to just how important they were, because because by the fact that they were mentioned shows that they were rare and unusual, perhaps for times of desperation. But what's often overlooked is the fact that as a using the term sacrificial victim is actually really, really charged. People that were sacrificed in the chronicles, in the sagas, at least from the ones that I've read, you guys have a much wider breadth of understanding, so you might have seen other ones that I've not yet read. Religion of Homework, but where was I? So when it comes to the sacrifices themselves, what's overlooked is that those that were sacrificed were willing to some degree. They were doing it because they wanted to. And when it comes to the sacrifice, people they don't quite understand the fact that, I'm going to ramble a bit here. Sorry, my brain's gone a little bit messy.
Go ahead.
When it comes to sacrifice, you are providing something that means a huge deal to you. And so when people see sacrificial victim with that charged terminology, they see it as something incredibly primitive and primal, which it is, but not through the eyes of someone that's so desperate because they believe that through their sacrifice they can impact change, they can provide some net positivity for their community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it also leads on to another really interesting point as well, because you said about, you know, what sources have described this. Now we're talking about Old Norse literature here, but actually it's not just literature written in Old Norse that is a useful source for heathenry, is it? Because a willing sacrifice is something that comes up in Ibn Fadlan's travels, which of course were written in Arabic. Originally written in Arabic, but and you know, takes place on the Volga River and all of that. But in that, the which obviously made very famous by 13th Warrior and all of that, so a lot of people know the story. But
great film, great film.
Yeah, but originally written down, you know, by an Arabic chronicler. And he describes how, the person that is sacrificed has agreed to it. You know, it's not a, right, you're being sacrificed now, you've got no choice. It's a, okay, let's do this. I'm going to go to the afterlife with my master, and I'm going to be, you know, have this place of honor and stuff like that. So that's interesting. Something else is interesting, and again, it goes on to sources not necessarily written in Old Norse, but I still think warrant a mention in this discussion, is a lot of the times when human sacrifice is described, and this is across the board, this is not just in relationship to heathenry, it's written by the enemies of the people that are writing it. So, you know, you look at the discussion about the Druids in Anglesey, and they did human sacrifice, according to the Romans writing in Latin, who were the enemies of these people. And, you know, could it be that the reason why there is human sacrifice in some of the Old Norse sources that are describing a heathen time is because they're written later by Christians, and they're trying to say, look how barbaric we were in the past when we were heathen. Now we're Christian. We'd never do this. So actually, was there that much human sacrifice, or is it a later addition to the text?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really tricky. And when you look at the Latin, like the Latin term itself, so if we look at the etymology of it for sacrifice, when it comes to the way that we can interpret it, it's just associated with the performance of some kind of duty. So it's quite a broad. That's quite a broad term. It's really, really difficult for us to then say that what were those priestly duties, because if, like you say, Dan, if you're the winner essentially of history and you're writing these tales, using that kind of terminology invites the person that's reading it to use their own personal bias to then go, "Oh, what were these duties? Was it something that I don't particularly agree with, or I see as perhaps savage or barbaric or overly primal or primitive?"
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think a sacrifice comes from the same root as sacrament, doesn't it? And sacred and all of that.
Well, I could just add something. As far as I understand, sacrifice, I forget the Latin, but it's just to make sacred. It doesn't mean kill with a long knife. It just means to make it sacred. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So the verb, so sacrifico would be the verb. It would be to sacrifice. Whereas if you look at what a sacrifice was, it does come from the same root as so sacrum is the initial, and that just means a sacrifice. But it could also mean a religious rite. It could mean a vessel that is sacred of some kind. So perhaps people have interpreted it as what's the most sacred vessel on earth, something that contains the lifeblood, the life force. That could be where we've got this. In some cases, not all, but in some cases where we've got this understanding of it being a human sacrifice, because they are the most sacred vessel, especially if you look at, the way that they are, the way that they are positioned by the more Abrahamic faith stems. But sacrifice as well, it could just be an offering to a deity. So, like taking it back to the very, very beginning where we're looking at translation work, it's so difficult for us to get a firm understanding, because of the massive amount of cultural identity that we've lost over the years.
Sorry, don't mind me. I'm just writing this down because it was just the thing that I have been muddling around in my head is the Old Norse association of things to do with blood and violence and religious and sacred elements like vigor. So I'm going to wait that down 1 second. So carry on. I'm just going to...
You're just mining us for content, are you?
Yeah, this is you found me out.
Ooh, Latin stuff.
I knew it.
Damn it. It's only been 3 episodes. Anyway, sorry.
I mean, you could go down a similar rabbit hole, and I think this bringing it back to literature and stuff like that, it just highlights the point that, like, going back through, translations always have someone's opinion in. Okay, let's go back to the Old Norse. Well, there's 4 different manuscripts. Okay, let's try and work. We've decided we like this one or this edition or whatever. Okay, now let's look at the words. Right, well, all of these words have got an etymology to them. They've all come from somewhere, and there's always interpretation. And so then you've got the interpretation of the writer, but also the interpretation of the audience. So, it's tricky, but I think, it's what makes it one of the many, many things that keeps it all very interesting and very exciting and means that we can have these debates. If you're just told this is the word of God, it's exactly what it says, and you've got to believe it, then okay, fine. But, that works for some people. But I think for most people that get into heathenry, they want to be able to think about things and to, work out what the meaning is to them. And, you can do that to such a level of depth with this stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's what I enjoy. It's it's a puzzle that we'll never have an answer to. So it's like a Rubik's Cube that we're just continuously turning and like going, what about this? Like, no, I think whatever. And you could fill endless hours of podcasting with discussions about just minutia of like a line. And honestly, it blows my mind, and for me, that's why a lot of my devotional work to the gods comes through from research and reading and sharing perspectives and just talking amongst each other. So yeah, in a way, this podcast is a devotional act for me.
Yeah, and I think what I like within heathenry specifically as well is that it's not often a case where you'll disagree with something in this minutia, and that will be a reason to have an actual argument where you're angry with the other person. Like, we can have philosophical discussion, and we can agree to disagree. Which I think is really nice. You very, very rarely see, I don't know, a heathen saying, I believe that this line in the saga was translated in this way because of this, and if you don't agree with me, then you're not a real heathen. That doesn't happen.
I mean, apart from the alt-right,
we argue about other things. Well, yeah, obviously there is the obvious, if you try to say, well, I read the Eddas and it justifies fascism, then no, go away.
I mean,
get in the bin.
I've heard that with the lay of Rick.
But I mean, it is an excellent point to raise, because, like you say, Dan, when it comes to having a discussion, I would say that every person that I've spoken to within this sphere, within this community, has been open to having their minds changed. So they may not have their mind changed by the end of it, and it's more of a verbal sparring of, can you sort of win me round? Which does also lead into those critical analysis skills. But being able to have a discussion about something where every point is designed to contribute rather than to denigrate or to diminish what the other person's response is going to be, I think is why it's why as a faith it is attracting perhaps more and more, because people are perhaps tired of the dogma of being told, well, if you don't worship this way, then you're wrong. Whereas now it's very much well, why do I have to do it that way? If it works for me this way, then would that not be enough for the gods, for the ancestors?
And I think you're also seeing people develop practices locally, let's say to their area, which have no basis in the sagas, nothing. But they're freely acknowledged that. Say, oh, well, this might not be written down anywhere, but we did a ritual this way. It seemed to work. It was good. We had a good response. So this is now a thing. We're going to start a tradition today. This is done. And as long as you admit that and don't claim that it was some person, some it wasn't that Odin told you and now everyone must do it this way. No.
Yeah, it's like I said way back at the start of the podcast. Like, not everybody has to be a scholar. And equally, not everything we do has to come from literature. I love literature. Like, it's a huge part of my life, especially at the moment. I'm literally sat here, like, drowning in books, most of which are medieval German, actually, but some Norse stuff still. But, that's not the entire basis of my practice. There is personal experience. There is, all sorts of other things. I mean, archaeology can have an influence as well. And again, could be another episode. How does archaeology influence your spiritual practice? And we could have a great discussion there. But the literature is great. It's hard work. There is a lot of good stuff there once you can dig through it, but it isn't the be all and end all of everything.
I agree, and I think if we're going to have a look at sort of the archaeology, which, by the way, if you would like me to come back, because I'm having a lot of fun this evening, we could certainly explore the practices of bog bodies, because I think that
bog butter as well.
Yeah, and but bog bodies, I think the term itself is just fantastic, but also bog bodies, it's great. Everyone needs one, right?
It's true. It's true, and I think we're going to fall down another rabbit hole here as well. But obviously, we're looking at a lot of this literature which comes from, what colloquially gets called the Viking Age, but it's, early medieval Scandinavia. But of course, we don't believe that our gods only came into existence in the 7th century or whatever date you want to set. We believe our gods are eternal, and that does kind of open it up to, well, okay, so what were our gods doing in the Neolithic? What
we have a
were
clue.
our gods doing?
which is from archaeology. You know of the Dagenham carving, the Dagenham statue?
Yeah.
And we don't know it's Odin, but one of its eyes is different.
Yeah.
Ooh, and that's like 4,000 year old or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always think that's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I don't think we want to say that every single carving of someone with one eye is definitely Odin.
Well, it is for me, Dan, and that's why you'll have to agree to disagree then.
There we go. And that's fine, because we're grown-ups and we can disagree.
I mean, I just thinking about the Dagenham idol, I think it's just testament to the fact that we as a species are obsessed with penis.
It's true.
I mean, yeah.
Well, it has a slot.
It does. It has a slot for.
Oh, and if you look at all the
what we mean is a phallic peg, which is just we are. We're obsessed.
So pegging is that old? That's fine. Sorry. But I'm thinking also about the carvings, the Neolithic carvings, or I don't know what year in Scandinavia and northern Russia, and it's just covered with the most graphic phallic imagery and boats. They like to run around.
Those
naked.
Are the two things.
Lots and lots of boats and lots of like naked men. Yeah, apparently.
Yes.
It is fundamentally crushing to my soul that I have to report, and I know this sounds really. Bear with me. I need to get through the point, but bear with me. I am fundamentally upset by the fact that I have to report all penis graffiti in my school because the kids are doing what every other person throughout history of. We've got graffiti on the wall in Roman times from like, the biggest peni. We've got the inclusion of phalluses in the Dionysia, where they would include it in their theatre performances and in one particular play, which is possibly one of the greatest. Not the greatest, but one of the greatest comedies, called The Wasps, where we had the chorus with these massive wooden or leather phalli, and they switched them round to their bums and then started stinging each other with them.
Wonderful.
We are
eyebrow stuff.
but it speaks to the focus on fertility, because that's something that continually arises. Even if you look at Ragnarok as well, yes, it is a time of destruction. Out of that destruction, there is a repetition to the cycle, and we see that fertility come through once more.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to sort of open it up to also, I mean, the Song of Songs.
Yeah, definitely.
And stuff goodness me, there's the stuff in there. And people say, "Oh no, it's about somebody communing spiritually with God." It's not the way it looks. People's parts are described with fruit and all. Oh goodness me, it's The reason I remember this is because in my copy of the Bible from school, when I was doing that, literally had one particular page of Song of Songs covered in that kind of illustration. Somebody,
nice.
Yeah.
Oh dear. I think there's a bit of a delay somewhere on a video. We'll figure it out in post. I just realised that that's on me, right, to do it. So I was like, I'd leave it to my assistant. Oh, it's me. But yeah, I love the switch between just talking about penises to Ragnarok. So it rocks my brain a bit.
I did so I whilst I was at Witchfest volunteering, I was explaining to a couple of people how heathens have this innate ability to swap between the dirtiest smut and the most highbrow academic conversations seamlessly. and it is a wonder to behold, because you're talking about, phalloi and having a good giggle about it, and then we can get into some really extreme smut, and that will somehow trigger someone to then go, but also in Egil Saga, did you hear about this, and how does that affect our fundamental belief structure?
Oh, it's brilliant.
There's some friends of ours who sell jewelry and stuff, and they have a particular inscription. I think it was written in runes, and it's somebody, shall we say, amorous love letter written on a rune stick.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's a little poem, but they said it's historically accurate, and they don't display it, but it is available. People ask for it, and the number of people who do. Oh yes.
It's basically your students are doing experimental archaeology, I would say.
I mean, yes, I have to report it, but I think I'm going to have to start phrasing it that way when I see it. But like,
It's got some
you'd be a
experimental.
great archaeologist. They'd look at me with crazed eyes, and go, "Are you mad?"
Well, I mean, it's one of my. We're spending quite a while on this subject now.
It's all good. It's all good.
One of my favourite cabinets in any museum in the world is in the Vindolanda Museum. And the reason it was one of my favourite cabinets was I was actually there. I was doing an archaeological dig with Operation Nightingale, which is a fantastic project, which basically it's rehabilitation for military veterans through archaeology. So I'm there, with a load of current and ex-military people. And, we get to this cabinet in Vindolanda and it is entirely filled with crudely carved and drawn phalluses.
Good.
And it's great because it's just like soldiers do not change. We're all there like, yeah, this is relatable. We've all carved a dick on the side of our barracks. Like, we've all done it.
Oh, amazing.
I mean, it's not like they had Netflix or much else to do. Once you played a few games of Roman dice, I think, well, time to draw another dick on the wall.
Just more for my own curiosity. Another thing for me
I thought you were going to say for your own collection.
Well, that too. I mean, I have a collection, so I'm not too worried about that. But what was? Sorry, Dan. What was the name of that operation you were talking about? Because I'd love to investigate that a little bit further.
Yeah, it's called Operation Nightingale.
Okay.
I say it's a brilliant thing. They do digs all over the country because there's actually a lot of the useful skills you get through the military are useful for archaeology, but at the same time, archaeology is quite sort of relaxing. It's got a purpose, and so it's really good for sort of rehabilitation for people with PTSD and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like I loved it when I did it.
Amazing. Do they have a website I could link to in the show notes?
I will have a look and see if they do. They've there's been a few episodes of Time Team that have been tie-ins with Op Nightingale. And so they do stuff all over the country. Oh, there we go. Nick's got the link. Yes, it was originally set up through Wessex Archaeology, which is Phil Harding's sort of local group. So he was involved right at the very start. I was actually there when it was launched. Another rabbit hole on HMS Victory back in 2011, I think, which was cool. I got to meet Phil from Time Team. I got to wear his hat. He doesn't know I wore his hat unless he listens to this podcast, and now he will know that I tried on his hat.
I just had a wonderful image as you were describing the operation being launched on HMS Victory. I just had visions of Phil Harding being fired off a gigantic fired as a catapult, sort of like, and wherever I land, that's where we shall dig first.
Yeah,
I had a different image. I had an image of Phil Harding just appearing outside of Dan's house, just in the window, annoyed that he's worn this hat.
He's an archaeologist. He'll just tunnel in.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, amazing. Wow, this has been a fantastic conversation.
Literature.
Well, I was going to mention, as well as all the primary sources, we've looked at those, but there's obviously, can we talk a little about later books that sort of like help me to understand that, if you see what I'm getting at, whether it's somebody's interpretation, because it occurred to me when we were talking about different interpretations and that being fine. I read Maria Kvilhaug's Seed of Yggdrasil, which I came across years and years ago and thought, well, this is just bizarre waffleness. Then having read tons more, came back to it again. It was, oh. And it was like, I don't necessarily agree with what she's saying, but this is my take on this bit of this saga. Oh, I'd never thought about it that way. I'm not sure I agree or disagree, but that's a completely different perspective I'd never have heard of. And that was incredibly thought-provoking book.
It's massive.
I would definitely recommend, and it's really reasonably priced for what it is, because it's huge. It's an absolute beast of a book.
Yeah, that's what my publisher is. Which is weird to say.
Yes.
But anyway, sorry, Dan.
So, Sif, all I was going to say is, like, there are quite a few such sort of secondary books that I could recommend, but I think rather than me sitting here and listing them all. It looks like Nick's already run off. So
I'm still searching for a particular book because I can't remember its title.
You're doing the same thing I was going to do. I was going to suggest I will give you a list that can be put in the links, which might be useful for people. I'm looking at my desk at the moment. It's largely covered in books about autism and Middle High German. So there's nothing immediately to
and
grab.
The connection there is, Dan? I'm not sure.
My PhD. That's the connection.
German, so no.
So my PhD is neurodivergence in 13th century literature.
Ah, okay.
Because well, I don't have to wait because I'm writing it, but also I wish somebody else was writing it. But yeah, there's none of my Norse stuff is easily grabbable, but I will put some stuff in the links.
I just made an absolute mess.
I cannot for the life of me find it, but it's an excellent book and nothing to do with heathenry, I'm afraid.
What's it about?
It's about how to engage with literature. So kind of how to critically assess something, essentially, but focused on literature and focused on like why we would do that. It's annoying me. It's really
how to explore a text or how to read a text. It's not that one, is it?
Yeah, no.
Is it how to read a book?
In my hand.
How to read a book, yeah.
The one I've got in my hand is this thing called Literature by Andrew Bennett and Nicholas Royle, and that's pretty good. It's fairly basic stuff, but it goes through reading a poem, reading a novel, reading a short story. What is literature? Thinking critically, that sort of stuff. So that's quite a good one.
That sounds good. That does sound. God, it's in my room somewhere.
Well, I'm sure you can tell Sif, and maybe they can just add it to the notes once you find it.
Yeah, I can do that.
And if I don't find it, then I'm just going to have to burn the place down, aren't I? Really? So...
You'll probably find it seconds after we finish the podcast.
You'll just be like, there it is.
Yeah.
Wait, you're not sat on it. You're not sat on it. Check.
No. I'll burn the house down, and the one thing that will be like available and alive, untouched, will be that damn book.
I have a recommendation. It's the Song of the Vikings, which I've posted about quite recently. It's basically Snorri's biography, but giving context of the stuff happening around his creation of the Edda. And I would, again, highly recommend that. It's not everything I agree with. I've made loads of notes. But if you want to have a greater understanding of the historical events that are happening, Snorri's motivation, who he was writing the Edda for, his political ambitions, and his family and all of that, I cannot recommend that book enough. I'm probably going to do a review on the YouTube channel for it, but yeah, that would be my recommendation.
I've just thought of another one. It's a novel, but it's a series of novels by Tim Severin, I believe, and essentially he's sort of cobbled together all of the sagas, inserted a new character who's a witness or sees them all happening. He's sort of there like this sort of Zelig or Forrest Gump or something like that. Not that he's a stupid person, but he's like he's there for this Burnt Jarl. Then he goes to Greenland for a bit, and just all kinds of stuff like that happens to him. And it's a good potted sort of like super dense. When I say dense, it's like it's very easy to read, but it's like it ticks an awful lot of the boxes of these things, and he's meant to be somebody who's witnessed everything. I think it's just called Viking or something like that.
Yeah. Something I realised there's another shelf behind me, so there are some books to hand.
Dan, don't lie. We know that your house is just made out of books at this point.
Yeah,
pretty much. So because I'm a Luddite, I don't know how to turn the camera on here, so I can't show you. But I'm literally literally like drowning in piles of books. But a handbook to Eddic poetry, edited by Carolyne, Larrington, Judy Quinn, and Brittany Shawn, is also a very good book. It's fairly academic, obviously, but there's lots of useful stuff in there. It explains a lot of terms that you might come across elsewhere, which is quite useful.
What was that called? Oh, sorry, Dan.
It's a handbook to Eddic Poetry, Myths and Legends of Early Scandinavia, and it's edited by Carolyne Larrington and others, Judy Quinn and the like. So that's useful.
I have another recommendation. Boop. On the very similar vein, the Poetic Edda, Essays on Old Norse Mythology. This is more academic, but that's edited by Paul Acker and Carolyne Larrington. If you get it from the publisher, it is cheaper than Amazon. But I recommend this one because of its absolutely amazing take by one second, I do have it here. I think it's John McKinnell. Is that his name? Yeah, John McKinnell, who suggests that Roland Darkvither was written in Yorkshire.
Oh, well.
So
all the best things are.
Andy then, really, isn't it?
Now then. Another one. I mean, we could just spend the next hour listing books, but
I'll tell you some books that aren't out yet, but I've heard a whisper that they are going to come out. It was an American author and Heathen, and he passed away fairly recently. I can't remember his name now.
Stefan Grundy.
Stefan Grundy, yeah. And two of his books are long out of print. They were published by the Troth, and now obviously they don't have the. But apparently, your publisher is going to republish Odin, God of Death. Yeah. Or God of Death ? So recommended, sort of like if you from a heathen perspective rather than just it's an academic heathen perspective. If that makes sense. So that should be really interesting.
It's also Dan's publisher as well now.
So,
my publisher too now. I do also have a contract with them. Final one I'll recommend verbally. I will send some more links, but Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek is a really, really handy one to have in your hand whenever you're reading anything and you come across a word, a place, a name that you're not sure what it is. It's literally a dictionary, so it's alphabetical order, and it will just give you a brief description of all sorts of things.
What's the other one that's very similar to that one, Dan? Can't remember. There's Simek and there's other one because I've had them both. And
is it this one?
Oh,
or is it
Handbook to Norse Mythology or something like that? There's one called the Handbook, and then there's a dictionary or something like that. They're both very similar titles, and but both are excellent. But I think one of them doesn't have an index at all.
I can check. Hang on. Simek does not have an index, but it's a dictionary. So,
however,
it is the index.
J. Stanley Hopkins has written one that's free on his website. So
okay.
Yeah.
Can you send me a link to that as well?
I can. Yes.
And
I'd like to make just a small recommendation if that's okay. This is entirely based on the fact that I saw, and I'm not going to mention his name just due to just to ensure that he remains confidential in his sphere of work. But he commented on the fact that there was not enough academic investigation or peer-reviewed journals within pagan spaces as a whole. So I'd like to recommend the International Journal for Heathen Research, because it is a really, really fantastic resource, which I've thoroughly enjoyed reading. Has got a good range of book reviews as well.
Amazing.
And hopefully Volume 2 will be available by the summer. If you would like to submit an article, please visit the AUK website.
Where's the link for that, by the way? Just because some things I'd like to...
Just inundate with me with links. I do have a copy of that, actually.
But yeah, no, seriously, because me and quite a few of us are involved with that publication.
Everything's falling off my shelf. There we go.
There you go. It is. You're right. There is a lack of sort of academic stuff written by heathens about heathenry, and we're trying to sort of redress that balance.
Yeah. Yeah, I simply mentioned that because I'd be keen to I don't know what, write something, but I feel like I want to write something, so
I look forward to it.
I mean, I wouldn't. There would probably just be heathenry in the sea coming up in the corner there.
There is another one which is not specifically heathen, but I think it's the only one I know of other one other than that journal is the Pomegranate, which is quite a highly respected academic journal, but which I put a link to in the side chat there.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about journals, just in general, I mean, Saga Book is fantastic. Obviously, it's not written by heathens, but it's just a journal for all things sort of Viking, and that's well worth looking at.
130 years old journal it's been running for.
Yeah, a long time. But there are plenty of other sort of academic journals on all things Norse-tastic, to steal my supervisor's term. There's stuff out there, but it is good to get stuff out there that's written, from a heathen perspective as well.
Yeah, and to talk more, just between each other. Anyone got any last thoughts?
Well, obviously, we can't mention literature and things like that without mentioning the Norse Myths and Legends for Children, illustrated by Rodney Matthews, who has some of the wildest interpretations of what the gods look like. They all look like have pointy ears. They all look like sort of Elric or something out of Warhammer 40k, sort of elves and stuff. It's fantastic.
I love that.
Other heathen children's books are available.
So I hear.
Yeah, quite a few at this point, I think.
Yeah.
Best part is that adults can read them too and learn stuff good. So
we do like to learn good.
Yeah, and the words are good. Amazing. I love the shameless plugs that are happening. It's great.
One thing you can tell you're really deep down the rabbit hole of becoming a deep sort of head in the books heathen is when you make that crossover, because from seeing a book that has a footnote, and you go, what's all that about? Just then seeing a book that has a footnote that's like nearly as big as the page, and you go, oh yes, this is the good stuff.
Yeah. Everyone knows that authors hide all the good shit in the footnotes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan wouldn't let me when he was reading my book.
Yeah, it's what they want to say but can't say in the paper itself. It's
Well, if you're really snotty, you include a quote but don't translate it. Hopefully, ideally from Greek.
Yeah. Greek is something else with that damn Aorus. God, yeah. Don't get me started on the ancient Greek.
No, I've seen it in so many sort of like books published in an era when probably most people could read a bit of it because of their classical education. But it was something like, and of course we can see this in the Greek play in this quote. Oh, great! That's wonderful.
Yeah, the Greek plays are great for quotes. One of my personal favourite is
put them into English though.
Well, I mean, you'll appreciate this one, Rich. Yeah. One of my personal favourite is from the Frogs, and it's where they've gone down into the underworld, and you have Dionysus with his little servant there, and they're going along on the river, and all you can hear is the frogs, which is the chorus at the time, going Brekka Kekek Coax, coax, over and over again. And the only translation for that is Brekka Kekek Coax, coax. Right?
Brilliant.
And he just Dionysus is there. It's like, can you please stop with the croaking? Stop with your damn coaxes. And then they Brekka Kekek. It's great. It's just stupid.
I mean, there are very funny lines in it. I remember. I think it's also from the Wasps, where him and his mate are going to the underworld for some, I forget why, but and there's a bit where they don't want to carry their bags with them.
Yeah.
And they see a passing corpse. Can you carry these? Well, what do I get out of it? What, you want paying? You're in the underworld. He says, well, no, grand don't come for free, man. I was, all right, okay, well, how about 2 obols? Oh yeah, 2 obols is fine. And this is obviously an inside joke that where the context has been lost. They'd look at each other, obviously at the audience. It's amazing what you can get for 2 obols these days, isn't it?
Well, it's because the currency was crashing at the time.
Was that what it was?
Well, basically, because the silver mines at Laurium that Athens had found were beginning to go dry, and they knew that. So,
I see.
Yeah, so the empire that they essentially forged throughout the Delian League, or through the Delian League, I should say, is they were really pushing for people to pay them more money, principally because they'd started to exhaust the silver mines at Laurium, which were mined by slaves. Because why would you pay people to make you money? That's But I love the frog. So Dionysus is going down with his servant to try and bring back a playwright to make the city happy again. and they go down and have an argument and a contest about the different playwrights, who's the best tragedian, and who's the best comedian as well. It's just a great play. It's just great. It's mainly shit jokes, I'll be honest, but it's just great. Yeah.
I mean, we could draw it back to the whole phallic symbolism and talk about there is some genuinely funny stuff in Lysistrata. It's very, very rude, very funny. But yes, well, we may get completely back onto that topic again. Perhaps you need a whole podcast just on that stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, Hellenic Polytheist Hangout.
Oh, can we? Because I could play with them then. It'd be fun. I dip my toe in both camps because, Greek heritage, classicist.
Which is funny because you can't see it. Look who's here. I don't know where you can see her.
I see a statue. It looks like Shield Athena.
Yep. Considering I was like, she is
Athene.
overlooking my books to be all wise.
That's a very, very wise idea.
And obviously, you've seen my tattoo of Athena.
I have.
And I appreciate the pun.
Just before we wrap up, can we take a minute to appreciate that we've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes? And I think the last time that Nick made a pun was over an hour ago. So, well done, Nick. That's impressive for you.
I'd like to point out that you either get academic Nick or pun Nick. There's no. It's very difficult to have both at the same time.
Well, thank goodness we had academic.
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, it was right there. I couldn't let that get away.
Yeah. No one could. No one could. Please let me come back. Please. Well, I tried.
Well, this has been amazing. I probably will. There probably will be a part 2 at some point, just because I think we simultaneously skimmed the surface and then plummeted for rabbit holes. That was the vibe. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining me on this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah,
it's been good. I needed this.
Guys, it's been great chatting to you again.
I will stop the recording now. In a moment. Adios, people. I won't say goodbye.
Bye.
We'll just fake buys. The fake buy.
Fake buy.
The fake buy.
The fake buy.
Does that count as a pun? A fake buy?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.